So when Nvidia announced their RTX 3080, 3090, 3070 GPUs, aside from all the stock problems, people really wanted to know, is my CPU going to be able to handle it? Something known as CPU bottlenecks came around. Of course, Intel mostly won that round simply because their CPUs were a little bit better geared for gaming. Now, AMD is coming with Zen 3, the Ryzen 5000 series. Does anything change? Should you be worried about CPU bottlenecks if you're looking for one of these CPUs? Let's talk about it. Hey guys, Tiago with Classical Technology here. Remember to subscribe, hit that notification bell, leave a comment below. Were you looking to get one of these new CPUs? Are you worried about CPU bottlenecking? And remember to smash that thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm. Alright, so let's get into it. A while back when Nvidia announced these GPUs, it seems like so long ago, and I know there are many valiant warriors searching for stock of 3080s, 3090s, and some are even optimistic they're going to be able to get a 3070. We'll talk about this in a different video, but we definitely have a difficult road up ahead with stock. But anyway, people want to plan and they want to know, is their current CPU enough for bottlenecking? We've discussed this previously. And more importantly, is the new Zen 3 Ryzen 5000 CPU gonna be a lot better for these higher end GPUs, therefore reducing any bottlenecking concerns? First, let's sort of summarize our findings from previously. These GPUs are very powerful, and yes, a lot of CPUs technically will bottleneck. That means that they're going to limit the frames per second that you're going to be able to get on something like an RTX 3080, 3090, and even the RTX 3070, which hopefully will be in stock. Anyway, a lot of the CPUs that were actually better for this was Intel. I know AMD is definitely, for the price for the dollar, much better in the market right now. It dominates everything. But if you wanted the most performance, let's say out of your 3080, something like a 10900K or a 10700K, 9900K, those would generally be the top CPUs that would be less likely to bottleneck your gaming, just because they have very low latency, very high clock speeds, great IPC. So generally, those were the CPUs that people went towards. AMD had a couple of in there that were also respectable, like the 3900X, 3950X, the 3800 XT. Of course, all the XT variants have a higher clock speed, but in general, AMD fell a little bit short of Intel in terms of CPU bottlenecking. So now that a lot of benchmarks and reviews are out, it actually does seem that something like the 3080, even at 1440p, it definitely can be affected by the CPU. These new GPUs are certainly very powerful. People are going to be using them on more and more powerful high refresh rate monitors. Previously in the past, the notion was if you're doing something like 4K, most of that sort of responsibility is going to be passed on to the GPU, meaning that it didn't matter as much what your CPU was. You'd be able to basically rely on your GPU. And as you went down the line to 1440p and 1080p, all of a sudden the CPU is going to play a much more important role at 1080p. And of course, the CPU is always going to be a little less efficient than something like a GPU, especially at a lower resolution. And therefore, especially at resolutions like 1080p and 1440p, that's where you're going to see most of these bottlenecks occurring with some of these slower CPUs. And of course, with 4K and beyond, they'll slowly and steadily diminish. So now we reach AMD's Zen 3 Ryzen 5000, which will be released November 5th. How did these fit in terms of CPU bottlenecking? Well, first, the good news is I think there have been vast improvements in Zen 3. In fact, AMD was even ballsy enough to be able to say that the 5900X is the new gaming king. If you guys know anything about Intel, every generation that AMD comes out with these amazing CPUs for great prices, Intel's always like, not so fast, we have a gaming king here. Technically it's faster, like the 10900K and things like that. And of course, while technically it's true, AMD certainly has won the hearts and minds of enthusiasts across the world, but now they've also won the gaming king crown, at least until Intel updates their 11th generation CPUs, which is also coming up fairly recently, and we can only assume that Intel's going to want to take that crown back, which of course this back and forth is great for us, the consumer. That means we're getting faster and better chips for better prices, instead of just being one sole competitor on the market. Now, out of the 4 new Zen 3 CPUs, we have the 5600X, we have the 5800X, 5900X, and the 5950X. Across the board, there are various improvements to Zen 3 that directly correlate to a much better gaming performance, therefore much lower risk of bottlenecking whatever game you're trying to play. For example, there will be much lower latency on these CPUs, which certainly have a big effect in gaming, in an area where Intel generally would win out. They're going to have better IPC, higher clock speeds. While they're not reaching the 5 and 5.3 gigahertz levels that Intel is reaching, certainly very respectable. Like the 5950X does go all the way up to 4.9, and the other CPUs, they're going to range around 4.7 to 4.8. Certainly not bad, certainly very fast, but it's still a little bit beneath what Intel can reach, and that limitation I don't think is really a big deal. It's just kind of how these Zen 3 chips are designed, and it doesn't mean they're really any worse. It's just a couple of differences. When it was much lower, like even in the 2nd generation Ryzen and a little bit in Ryzen 3000, of course it would make a significantly bigger difference in certain games, and especially at 1080p versus Intel. But now AMD is very close. They're really neck and neck with Intel in terms of gaming, which really hasn't been the case for a long time, even with the Ryzen 3000 series CPUs, which are absolutely fantastic, bang for your buck. I personally use a 3950X. I think it's one of the best CPUs out there, and the 5950X looks absolutely incredible with 16 cores, 32 threads, going all the way up to 4.9 gigahertz. That's going to be sort of a content creation and gaming beast all in one. Very exciting. Now, technically, AMD says that their best gaming CPU, the Gaming King, is going to be that 5900X, which is a 12-core, 24-thread CPU. Now, historically, the 3900X definitely was an amazing CPU. I think that's the first one that we thought, okay, mainstream AMD is going into an area where generally it was sort of the HEDT or the high-end market, like when Intel had their 6950X and even, the 9980XE and things of that nature. Because now for the first time we had a 12-core, 24-thread CPU for under $500, and in fact you can find them as low as like $399 now. So it's going to be very exciting to have a 5900X with that same core count, but much better specs for gaming. Like we mentioned, lower latency, better IPC, higher clock speeds. So all of these vast improvements mean only one thing: a lot less CPU bottlenecks. And all of these Ryzen chips seem to have anywhere from like a 19 to 26% improvement in gaming over the 3000 series generation. Maybe that's why they skipped the naming of the 4000 series, Ryzen chips. Maybe they figure the performance leap is so good that we're going to go straight from 3000 to 5000, which is fine. The real reason I think is that 4000 is their CPU and their laptop, their mobile lineup. So they wanted to make a little bit of a difference. And honestly, skipping a number like that makes sense because it's a pretty good improvement. Anytime we're in the 20 to 20% plus range of improvements in PC hardware, people generally get very happy. A big case in point, we can see the Nvidia 3080. Look at the massive gains that it has over the previous 2080, even the 2080 Ti. It threw out some big numbers beforehand, and that's why the hype was really high. And I think AMD did the same thing with the hype sort of in their processors coming up now. You can see that with these new CPUs, they targeted the gamer and enthusiast directly. They didn't really plan on adding any more cores, at least from the SKUs that we have now. Who knows, maybe above the 5950X, they could release something else that's a little bit beefier, like a 24 core in the mainstream, which would be pretty sick, pretty amazing. But I don't think they're going to do that right now. It looks like they kept the core count the same as previous generation, but they really focused on the exact thing that Intel taught them to do, which is gaming performance. And that means that in general, CPU bottlenecks should not be an issue with these processors. Now, of course, if you get a 5600X, in general, you're going to get across the board a little bit less performance than a 58 or a 5900X. We have to remember here that the 5900X seems to be the one that performs the best in terms of gaming, even though the 5950X does have more cores. It's a 16 core versus 12 core. core. As you know, in gaming, that doesn't make as big of a difference. And sometimes when you have less cores to a CPU, you can actually push up that gaming performance on single core workloads considerably better than something like a big 24 or 32 core CPU. You would think those would be the best at everything, but it's funny how it works. It really isn't. Sometimes a single core beast that's much cheaper actually does better in gaming. So that's why I really think that these new CPUs coming out are like super optimized for gaming. And that means that they're super optimized not only for the new Nvidia 3000 series GPUs that have come out, but also we must remember that we have the RX 6000 series Big Navi AMD GPUs being announced at the end of the month. And for sure, as we've seen so far, they're going to be competing with like the 3080 level performance. So for the first time, AMD really is encroaching on Nvidia space. And that means that now they have some massive CPUs to pair with these GPUs. And they're well aware that they don't want these new GPUs to be bottlenecked. So people are going to want to use their own Gaming King level CPUs to pair with AMD's new GPUs, and therefore completely erase any thoughts of any gaming bottlenecks. I really don't think AMD would want people to go out and buy their big beefy GPUs, and then people say, well, now I need an Intel CPU so I don't have any bottlenecks, so they have to get something from Intel. AMD really wants to sell you the whole package. That's why they focused on gaming for this new generation. So that's why I'm super excited to test these when they're released, because I think now for gaming, CPU bottlenecks are much less of an issue than they were with previous generation Ryzen CPUs. So we can enjoy not only their multi-threaded performance, but also now their single core Gaming King level performance. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Remember to thumbs up, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you guys on the next video.